Welcome back to American Dream. Activists and the FBI criminal database. Discussing this tonight, rejoining us is David Remes with Covington and Burling, and Kate Martin. Welcome to American Dream. I'm Tina Richards. I'll be your host tonight. The FBI criminal watch list. Who's on it? Are criminals on this? Are these activists? Recently, there has been people rejected at the Canadian border working with the FBI terror watch list and the criminal database, rejecting people from the border. Most recently, Colonel Ann Wright, a retired colonel and state diplomat, and Medea Benjamin, the founder of Global Exchange and Code Pink, were denied entry into Canada as parliamentarians were over on the other side waiting for them to enter. Why is this happening, and is this something, a road that America wants to go down for their security? That's what we'll be discussing tonight. And to discuss that, we have with us David Remes from Covington and Burling, partner. And we also have Kate Martin, the director for the Center for National Security Studies, and Medea Benjamin, which is the founder of Global Exchange and Code Pink, and Shahid Butar with the Washington Peace Center on the board of directors. Thank you all for joining me. And I'd like to go ahead and just start a little bit with what happened to you.
Well, first let me say, as the founder of Global Exchange 20 years ago, it was an organization I started because I believe in people-to-people ties, and especially when our government often has policies that don't reflect what many of us in this country believe, it's important for us to be citizen diplomats and travel the world and meet people.
I mean, right now you're have a peace brigade that is doing trips over to Iran during the time.
We go to Iran every 2 months. We have groups that go.
This is an important part of your organization, is this international travel to deliver different messages than perhaps what the official government line is.
And to build a global people's movement. We believe that irrespective of governments, people want to and need to get together and communicate about issues that are important to us, the environment.
But then you go to the border, and what happens?
Well, I have been to Canada many times. We had a peace conference in Canada in June, a wonderful gathering of people from the U.S. and Canada. I went to Canada in September and to Quebec. I travel oftentimes to Canada. But when I went in October, something strange happened, which was I was stopped at the border, and I was with Colonel Ann Wright, and both of us were taken aside. We were shown a file that they printed out on us that came from an FBI criminal database, and we were told that because we had convictions as part of peaceful protests against the war, we were inadmissible into Canada. Canada is the only foreign country that is using an FBI database to determine who can enter the country.
Now, are they the only one? Because I was reading up that that the G8 countries are now talking about using that same database, which means it will be expanding who is going to be, what countries that peaceful protesters are going to be denied entry to. Now, Kate, you have a little bit of history.
I just want to say on that, and before we forget, that is why this is so important, because right now it's only Canada. Canada is not the only country. Canada is the first country. And so if Canada gets away with doing this, I think we will see it spread to other countries. And that's...
Yeah, the G8 countries are now talking about discussing using this database. Can you give us a little history about what exactly is the FBI criminal database?
Well, it's not the terrorist watch list per se. It's a database that was set up 20 or 30 years ago. It was intended as a repository for criminal history records, and we, the civil liberties movement, were very concerned at the time that it would contain arrest records and people would be discriminated against because they'd been arrested without being convicted, that it would contain records of convictions on minor offenses. In this case, you're talking about civil disobedience that would then follow the person. And its purpose originally was to be available to local police who might stop somebody to see if there was an outstanding arrest warrant for them. Since 9/11, the purpose of the database has morphed, and it has now been expanded to be used to include records on, quote, terrorism. I don't know that Medea was in that field of the database, but it's been expanded to include hundreds of thousands of records on undocumented immigrants, or some of them who are documented, to be used as a police tool to go after immigrants in this country.
Wasn't there something there between all Middle Eastern males between the age of 16 and 45 were now, as part of the visa program, required to be put on this watch list?
That was a different program, actually. You know, one of the things about the government is that it has multiple databases of Americans, and one of the problems since 9/11 has been that there's almost no oversight or limitation on how those databases are used. And so the U.S. government and the Canadian government apparently entered into an understanding that they would share the database and use it to deny Americans the right to travel to Canada to meet with Canadians.
Is this not unlike, perhaps, David, you can answer this, right now, after 9/11, there was cooperation with other countries about the visa permits, who's allowed in to America, and this seems to be like now going through the reverse, where Canada is now doing pretty much the same thing.
Well, there's already been evidence of sort of a deformed relationship between the United States and Canada here. There was a Canadian citizen named Maher Arar.
Didn't he just recently testify to the Senate through
I
video
so.
uplink, because he can't come into America?
The Canadian government turned over to the U.S., that the U.S. rendered to a third country where he was tortured, and then he got back to Canada. Canada finally admitted their mistake. He was just awarded $11.5 million in damages to compensate him for his suffering. The United States still hasn't admitted that it was a mistake. But what seems disturbing to me is the fact that the sort of anti-terrorist paranoia here has spilled over to Canada, which I think culturally has not been so inflamed. For example, it took Vietnam protesters, and I just don't think it ever had the chill here that we've had during times of war. Now, without knowing all the facts too deeply, Medea, in your case, what troubled me from what I read was the secondary screening. If you accept in principle that it's okay for people with convictions to be put on a general list that's done in a way that's not discriminatory, that's one thing. But the people who will get pulled aside for secondary screening, in my experience, that tends to be a political element. I went to Yemen a few months ago with a journalist, a documentarian, and when we got back, she was pulled into a room at Kennedy Airport, and they spent an hour going through her papers. They copied down every name in her address book, got all of her contacts, and reviewed all of her papers and even seized her papers. That, to me, was an act of political intimidation.
Now, there's one other thing that I was reading that I was interested in, is that prior to this time, September 11th, pretty much it was somebody's actions that triggered them being put on a list, such as a criminal record, so on and so forth like this. But they're talking on some of these lists that it's more like a dragnet list, where you have to prove that you're not part of the, the criminal elements.
The overbreadth of data inclusion and surveillance is one of the central problems that we're facing in this country. And if we think about it over the course of history since 9/11, it's a very long-standing problem. The detention of American activists at the Canadian border, while problematic,